Morning. Welcome to week 2 of psychology. I'm really impressed with how everybody's doing, first off. Most of you are finding your discussion boards. Most of you are watching these videos. Most of you are talking to me and responding to my emails. I did this in an update, but I just want to clarify what the emails are about. So in order to take an online class, we have to somehow account that you are in this online class. And so it's really kind of a legal responsibility for us to communicate once a week. And it has to be individual and it has to be customized to you. So I can't just send out an update and all of you guys click like on it. And so I'm going to send individual messages to you via Schoology every week. What I need you to do is respond to me on them. And we can, quite frankly, we can talk about anything. But in particular, I might ask you questions about your understanding about specific stuff, and I would like you to respond to that. And me grading your graded discussions or grading your notes doesn't count as two-way communication legally. So again, if you could just do me a favor and really make sure that you are responding to those emails. Their week is Wednesday to Tuesday and not Sunday to Monday like every other week. So I will send out an email to you on Wednesday, and then I need you to respond to me. If you just do it immediately, it counts, but definitely respond to me by the beginning of the next week. So I think I left you with the scenario and never answered the questions, if I am correct about the first week. So we left with this investment scenario, and I asked you to think critically. And the answer is that a lot of investment brokers do this, but they do a very interesting thing. So they'll send out 2 letters. One letter will say, the stock market will go down. And one letter will say, the stock market will go up. And they'll send it out to 50,000 people. It's just a form letter to anybody. And then once they send it out, they figure out who they sent, half the letters to that was correct when the stock market went up. And they'll just ignore everybody else that they sent when they were wrong. And then on that population, they will send 2 more form letters to. One saying the stock market will go up and one say the stock market will go down. And then they will create a group of population in which they were accurately predicting the stock market and accurately predicting whatever they're saying. And they will keep narrowing that population down. So that population will think that they accurately predict the stock market going up or down, when in reality they're just tricking you. So the whole point of this little riddle here is to make sure that you don't get tricked. And so when we do psychology, we want to make sure we don't get tricked. One of the reasons that ways we do get tricked in psychology is that we blur. Well, first off, let's look down here. We read the headlines and no one ever reads the replication failures. And unfortunately, I think that the most prevalent example of this is vaccines and autism. The headline hit 15 years ago that vaccines were thought to, cause autism. But nobody really reads the retractions. I mean, I think there's a push now to read the retractions, but pretty much 99% of all scientists agree that it was not good science. The guy that did the original research could not replicate it. He's actually banned from practicing medicine. And they think that he actually created a lot of the research that he published in order to become famous and have these headlines. And so there's a lot of people out there that still associate vaccines and autism. And there's just an overwhelming amount of evidence that supports that autism is genetic and autism might be environmental, but it has nothing to do with the vaccines. And we're having really interesting social consequences for people who are believing in a headline, which we would all want to do, but then not doing the research that talks about how we have never been able to replicate that. Another issue with psychology is that we blur research, diagnosis, and therapy. So as psychologists, we really want to do some serious research and use the scientific method, but we also have to diagnose people with severe depression or anxiety. And then we also you know, we're sitting in the office with them. They're talking to us about their severe anxiety, and we really want to help them, you know, have some therapies that will, you know, help them change their lives or control their manic episodes. And unfortunately, it's, you know, we talk about it as clinical opportunism, where there's like this little distinction between new research, diagnosis, and therapy, and we could jump really too quickly to diagnosis, and sometimes very much too quickly to therapies for a cure without doing the extensive replication. And then there's also ethical considerations when it comes to experiments. I don't know if anybody is familiar with the Stanford's prison experiment or the Milgram shock experiment, but look those up. We'll study them in Unit 14, but that doesn't come until like the last trimester. But there's a lot of questions about the ethics behind studying humans and human subjects. We can't just cut open somebody's brain and see what's going on there and say, oh, this is what it is. That does damage to the human. We can't try to solve issues with nature versus nurture, which is the focus of this week coming up, by putting a child in a box and seeing if you know, there's any influence on personality when there's no influence on the environment. So we just can't do those. These are experiments that we can't do on humans, and so we try to come up with interesting ways in which we can. So I don't know how far along you guys got. I think we talked about not questioning everything. I'm pretty sure we went over the definition. If not, it's definitely in Unit 1 for you. I did talk to you about listening to this TED Talk last week. I'm not sure if everybody did, or if you just got caught up in the myelobotomy. This is a great TED Talk that talks about like real science and the teenage brain, and it describes how you do an experiment. And she is really fabulously intelligent when it comes to the prefrontal cortex and the development of the prefrontal cortex in teenagers. And she talks about there's a real distinction between how the teenage brain works and how the adult brain works. And that can explain a lot of differences between adults and teenagers in social environments. So I really want you to watch this. It's worth your time for sure. What should you do during this video? Get out your vocabulary list and your notes from Unit 1 chapter and see if you can, again, link what is said in this video with what we've already talked about in this class. Try to link as many things in the outside world with what you are doing in this class. So as you read a unit in psychology, don't just go, oh, I gotta read this and do, you know, vocabulary, blah, blah, blah. We hate Mrs. Hinadaw, especially online, blah, blah, blah. Don't do that. Well, you could do that, but, you know, whatever. But look for psychology outside of the textbook and outside of your life, and then try to link it. Why does Mrs. Hinadaw say this? Because she might know a smidgen about how the brain works. And if you can link information that you read to information that you see in the world, you are way highly more likely to remember that stuff later on. It's called systematic encoding. It's called Unit 8 when we develop memory and how we learn. And it just works if you can find relevant examples outside. If you can listen to TED Talks that are relevant to psychology, if you can link to NPR, if you can read something, heck, in like, you know, a fiction book and say, hey, I'm reading currently about a psychopath. You know, just any time that you can link what you're doing in life to what you're trying to learn in school will help you learn it a lot easier. So again, link, and then watch this video. She's really, really cool. We're not going to watch it together though. Sorry. So overall takeaways. After you get done watching this video, what was the big idea of the talk? What were some of the aha moments that you had in this TED Talk? Some questions that you can ask, you know, or, you know, link to your reading, etc. I think I talked enough about this, so I want you to think about this stuff. So we're a little bit behind. I really feel like I need to talk to you about the history of psychology before we go on to scientific methods. So here's your quick version of how we got here. How did we get all the way up to the point where we've got functional MRIs that can measure the prefrontal cortex of teenagers and decide that they don't do a really good job on seeing other people's perspectives. That was in the TED Talk. So first, what we have to understand is there was a lot of Eastern philosophers way before Aristotle and way before Plato and Socrates that contributed, began us down this road to psychology and thinking about the human mind. So we have Buddha, Confucius, India, any kind of yoga and meditation in the Eastern world is really all a mind-body connection. And what's really interesting is the most modern version of this sometimes is called an approach in psychology of humanistic, where it's not just about abnormal psychologies. It's not just about how do we clinically diagnose and treat depression. Humanistic psychology is a little bit more like positive psychology, and it talks about how can we make lifestyle changes in our environment, in our physical world that would help us combat depression that's not just clinical answer. So a humanistic psychologist would address somebody with depression and they would talk about exercise and they would talk about meditation and they would talk about positive thoughts and surrounding themselves with positive people and making some serious lifestyle changes if they can't get out of that depression. That's very much influenced by Buddha, Confucianism, and India yoga meditation. So it's making my point is it's making kind of a resurgence in the West with this thing we call humanistic psychology. Do know your ancient Greek philosophers that influenced later thinkers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, excuse me. I call him the scientist because he was way more empirical than anybody else. So Aristotle looked for evidence in the world to talk about the mind and body. Plato and Socrates were more philosophers that looked inward to try to figure out what the mind and body and soul connection was. Aristotle was like, you know what? We need to see empirical evidence. And so he kind of got us in this path of science. The real science started in the 1600 with the scientific revolution. Of course, there's a little bit of Western bias there because we assume the whole world wasn't, doing science, but the whole world was. But let's just talk with Western societies. 1600, we have the birth of modern science for us. No Descartes, they talk about him a little bit in your textbook. He was very interesting because he talked about there's a distinction between the mind and the body. They're separate things. And he talked about the immaterial mind communicating with the body, excuse me. This is so, I just find this so fascinating because he called them the animal spirits. I want you to remember this and connect it when we talk about synapses in the brain in Unit 3B, because his theory was the brain had cavities, and they called them animal spirits that flow through nerves, sending messages to the body. Now, if you take out that word animal spirit, if you take out brain capacities and you replace that with the brain matter has synapses that send messages through nerves, you've just got, basically the nervous system where the brain is sending impulses. You got to get over the language of animal spirits, but I'm just saying, Descartes, he might have been onto something, a man before his time. The next man, we have Francis Bacon. He was known as the father of modern science. He is so much about empirical evidence. He lived in the height of superstitions, and he was like, dude, we are failing as human beings. We have so many errors of cause and effect. And so he was like challenging the superstitions of the times. He talked about errors in cognition, cause and effect errors. He talked about how we perceive patterns in random events that do not exist, and then we remember them and confirm them. The easiest example of this is people that believe that good things happen in threes are the same people that think bad things happen in threes, or anything happens in threes. It's a human phenomenon. It just doesn't exist, but you can't prove somebody that bad things don't happen in threes because they're in charge of their own counting. So I want you to think about it. A bad thing happens to me. I note it. I say that's number one. Another bad thing happens to me. I'm like, oh my goodness, that's number two. What a coincidence. And then another bad thing happens to me and you're like, doom, confirmed my theory, bad things happen in three. What happens when the fourth thing happens? What happens when the fourth bad thing happens in people's brain? They simply start recounting. That's number one again. So, I mean, we desperately want these patterns. We desperately want to make sense of the world, and we fail. And we fail miserably, especially with that one, because you just simply start recounting from the beginning to prove your point and confirm your theory. So humans understand from a particular nature easily supposes a greater degree of order and equality. So basically what this quote is saying is that we like order, we like equality, we like things to be easy, we like to find meaning in things, and we select our memories to confirm what we believe. So we select how high we count. If the theory was bad things happen in 10, we'd count to 10 and then restart when the 11th thing happened. The next person that we'd like to talk about is, whoops, sorry to go backwards here, John Locke. He is very interesting because he really begins our path down this concept of nature versus nurture. We pretty much presumed that people were born the way they were born just because they were born that way before John Locke. And John Locke is basically saying, you know what? We imprint the world onto people. People are blank slates when they're born as babies. They have no experience, and we write on that slate, and we create their experiences and their personalities. So our experiences in the world literally create who we are. Bacon and Locke really give us together this modern concept of empiricism. So it's the idea that knowledge originates in experiences, and that science should be therefore relied on observation and experimentation. So here we start down the path of no longer philosophy, no longer ideas. We are officially on the path to observation of human behavior, experimentation of human behavior, data collection. Whoops, I don't know what that happened there. Hopefully a thing doesn't pop up. Dang it. Hold on for a second. Gotta force quit something here. There we go. So really the birth of modern philosophy started with Wilhelm Wundt and structuralism and William James functionalism. This is 100% always on the AP test, Wundt and James, and figuring out who did what here. If anybody asks you who the father of modern psychology is, please say Wundt and not Freud. Freud is the modern of psychodynamic psychology. He is not the father of psychology. Wilhelm Wundt is. And Wilhelm Wundt is because he was the first guy that did it in the lab. He was really the first scientist that tried to look at inside a human being's experience in a scientific way. So we are looking inward. Introspection, Wundt and Titchener can go together. Introspection is a tool for gathering data about what is going inside the brain. James and functionalists talks about adaptive thinking. He talks more about emotions, memories, willpower, habits, moment-to-moment stream of thoughts. But again, he's still a scientist that is trying to talk.
Modern research was a great dent.
Trying to talk about what is going on in the brain. So one is trying to find the structure and makeup, and one is trying to find the meaning. So this is what how I describe it to class. Structuralists are looking at the design of the house. So a structuralist is trying to find the attic, trying to find the basement, where's the living room, the kitchen, how many bedrooms is there? If you think of the brain as a house, okay? James is saying, what's going on in the living room? What happens in the kitchen? Why does the house have an attic? And how does the attic work? So the structure of the brain is how is it set up? The function of the brain is why is it set up that way and how does it work? The structure of the house is that it's a 3-bedroom ranch. The function of the house is that you sleep in the bedroom. Okay? And let's watch this quick little video. It's only a minute.
The innovations of such researchers as Wilhelm Wundt. Wundt designed the first controlled research in a lab setting, and his approach was later known as structuralism. In this setting, Wundt and his colleagues studied perception. Some experiments simply involved recording how the subject responded to sounds, or how the subject reacted to the dropping of a large rubber ball. Wundt also developed the method introspection, where he asked subjects to report their feelings and sensations after dropping the ball to the ground. Although Wundt believed that he could gain insight into how the brain works by asking subjects how they feel, this approach was criticized for being unreliable and prone to bias. His methods as a whole were often criticized for being too narrow or subjective. In 1890, William James attempted to explain how consciousness functions with his book, The Principles of Psychology. Because James's theories attempted to explain the function of consciousness rather than the structure, his approach was appropriately named functionalism. James borrowed heavily from Darwin's ideas that mental processes evolve over time to aid the overall survival of humans. Although the early psychologists may have disagreed over how to conduct research, these clashes led to improvements in the science and shaped the methods used today.
Two most important people in early psychology, for sure, because they both give us experimental psychology. 1879 to 1920, you have this rise in basic, well, here we go. We got this. Structure, relevance of the mind, introspection. We're going to move on because this is going to be really, really long. Before we move on, though, William James, Mary Whiton Calkins, and Margaret Flo Washburn. Not only was William James an American who really studied functionalism and why emotions exist and what is their function of exist, but he was a really fabulous advocate for women's rights in psychology. So in your book, note what he did for these two women. I think Mary Calkins was denied into Harvard, and William James said, no, she's coming. And then everybody else that was in the PhD program quit because the audacity of a woman coming into the program. And James was like, I don't care, quit. I'm going to still teach her because she's pretty fabulous. So he's a ally when it came to women breaking into this industry. And I think Margaret Washburn was the first American president of the APA. And so she is pretty fabulous also. Hopefully I don't get those two mixed up, but note who they are. And that James, excuse me, was essential in helping women break down that barrier. So this little slide is just about how philosophy and biology influence psychology. And so does a lot of other things, but it kind of like spurs out of this medical industry plus philosophical industry. So what was he? He was a physiologist and a philosopher. James was a philosopher. We haven't talked about Pavlov's, but maybe some of you have heard about Pavlov's dogs. He was a physiologist. Freud was a physician. He was just a doctor before he became the legendary Freud. And Jean Piaget was a biologist. So we have this marriage of biology, science, and philosophy coming into fruition when it comes to psychology. In the 1920s, we had a groundbreaking discovery by Watson and then Skinner. And this was the scientific study of human behavior. These guys wanted nothing to do with how people thought, and they only wanted to do with how people behaved. And they believed that was the only ethical thing could ever observe scientifically, is the study of human behavior. We could not get in somebody's brain, nor should we try. And so you have Watson and Skinner, that create something called behavioralism. I don't have that written up there, but it's most definitely in your textbook. So Watson and Skinner goes to behavioralism. Speaking of which, in your notes, I might create a list of people and a list of what they study and what they did. So I would start it with Wilhelm Wundt, structuralism, first lab. Then I'd go to James, functionalism. You might include the ladies that he helped get into the profession, Calkins and Washburn, because that was absolutely notable. Create a thing that says Watson and Skinner, scientific study of human behavior, which is behavioralism. It just might be a really good study habit to get into, is making sure that you note people and what they are doing. The next, after the 1920s, these guys come around in about the 60s, I believe. You have Rogers and Maslow, and they talk about the emphasis, going too fast, the emphasis on mental health. And so they are the exact opposite of behavioralism, and we call these guys humanistic. I mentioned them earlier with the Eastern philosophies, but make sure you know these guys' names. And then finally, we have the cognitive revolution that come out of the 70s and 80s, and the huge growth of neuroscience and the connection of the biology of the brain with mental activities. So with the cognitive revolution, we are talking about a biological and cognitive revolution when we have this growth of the technology area. We have CAT scans created, EEGs created, the PET scan, the fMRI, and the MRI. And so when that comes around, we have this massive neuroscience revolution where we marry biology, technology, and cognition. We're going to hit all of these in different units. Like learning, I think this is unit 6, is all about Skinner and Watson. Motivation and emotions is all about Rogers and Maslow's. The cognitive revolution, I think, is unit maybe 7, where we talk about this, and most definitely unit 3 when we talk about the biology of the brain. So here's your little timeline. You might want to write a timeline down in your notes or screenshot this or something. But psychodynamics, this is Freud. Behavioralism, Watson and Skinner. Cognitive revolution with the creation of new technologies. The rise of genetic studies and biological psychology, and antidepressants, and the study of neurotransmitters and dopamines. That's all unit 3. Alongside, you got humanistic. And then a social cultural study of psychology is kind of like a catch-all. So we dump everything into this category and we try to make sense of all of it. Okay. Again, psychology, science of behavior and mental processes. This website has a great evolution of psychology. It has everything bulleted point. It's even got ancient Egypt in there, but it takes you through pretty much everything. There's a lot. Study suggestion, create a timeline of the history with the notable people. I guess you could maybe do that with the list, also put the date in there. Okay, so this week that was kind of a review and summary, hopefully, of your notes from last week, but this week we're going to talk about the approaches. And we are going to discuss nature versus nurture. So in your discussion boards, I'm asking you to pick an approach to psychology. And I want you to say nature versus nurture. Now, this screen right here is really important for your graded discussion because I have put that on your spectrum. So if you notice right here, nature is the concept that personality, behavior, characteristic traits, and all comes from biology and genes. So when we talk about the nature versus nurture question, and we talk nature, we're saying you are who you are because of your DNA, this double helix here. And then I've kind of given you a spectrum of where these fall. Okay, so if you're somebody that's going to say, hey, you know what, I do believe that people are just born the way they are, then the approach that you should take on your discussion board is a biological approach. And you're going to read about the biological approach in your unit, and you're going to answer the questions on the discussion board as if you are a biological psychologist. Okay? Now, this is the most nurture-ish philosophy out there. And then evolutionary approach goes a little bit more towards the environment. Psychoanalysis approach, that's Freudian, goes a little bit more to the nurture. The cognitive approach is pretty solidly in the middle, so they kind of say 50-50. Humanistic approach is saying, you know what, we are a lot about our social environment. The sociocultural approach says we are even more about our social environment. And behavioralists like Watson and Skinner that I previously mentioned are 100% social environment. Watson was one time quoted that saying that if you give me 100 babies and total control of their lives, I can make 100 doctors or I can make 100 criminals. I will just manipulate the social environment until I get what I want. So again, discussion boards. We are going to combine the concept of nature versus nurture. And we are going to link it to an approach. And we are going to have our weekly discussion on that topic. Modern approaches usually combined all of these. And this is just something right from your textbook. And I want to just talk about a little bit because each unit, your author in this textbook will kind of break down major concepts. So when we get to unit 5, they talk about hypnosis, and they talk about the biological influences of hypnosis, the psychological influences of hypnosis, and the social cultural influences of hypnosis, which then cause behavior to change and your mental stability to change when you're under hypnosis. So when you talk about biological influences, you're talking about natural selection of adaptive traits. You're talking about genetic disposition, you're talking about your brain mechanics. You're talking about neurotransmitters, levels of neurotransmitters, levels of dopamine, synapses connections, anything biologically that's going on in your brain, in your body. You're talking about the level of estrogen or testosterone. So any of that is biological influences that would cause your behavior. So if you're going to explain aggression and why some people are aggressive, a biological approach would say they have too much norepinephrine in their body. So they've got the fight and flight thing, and the amygdala is powering up, which is making them be very, very aggressive because they are in a state of fear because of the amygdala. A psychological influence would be learned fears and other learned expectations. It's an emotional response. It's cognitive processes and perceptual interpretation. So how is psychology different than biology? It says that, first it views in, but resumes in, but it says that we have different perceptions of realities that create different behaviors. So the same thing can be going on in our brains, but our brains perceive it differently. And that's the difference between biological and psychological. Okay. Social cultural says, hey, there's other people around me. That's why I'm aggressive, because other people are aggressive, or I was taught to be aggressive, or my dad's aggressive, or my mom's aggressive, or I live in a violent culture or society. Peers and other groups influence your behavior. Maybe you're aggressive because you're conforming and you want to be liked. Or you are told by the media and social forces that violence solves answers. The answer can be all of the above. The answer can be I have overabundant amygdala that produces a lot of fear in my brain. I was born that way. And I perceive my experiences as, threatening on a regular basis. And I play violent video games. And so all of this is going to cause me to be an extremely violent person. So these approaches are like specialities, but it doesn't mean that the answer is not D, all of the above. That is why somebody is doing this. Are these perspectives contrary? Is there room for free will? That's an overarching question about psychology. Pandura, we're going to learn a lot about when we talk about social learning, but he also had this theory of psychology of agency, meaning that we are actually in control of our own body once we become an adult and our own psychology. So we intentionally regulate our own behavior and life circumstances. And so we do have some major control over things. There's this concept that we have intention, forethought, and self-reactiveness, meaning that we have intentions, we think about what we're going to do, and then we do it, and then we react to what we do. Okay? So we are not just the producers of our own experiences, but we are actually the product of our own experiences. So it's both. So we control our lives, and because we control our lives, it actually causes us to be products of the life that we are creating. It's more of a cyclical view of the world. So that was a lot, and I feel like I'm talking too much. So I'm going to end this lecture here because I think we've hit pretty good on the graded discussions to get you started. I'm going to do another one that starts over because I want you to digest this one, take a little break. And it's going to go talk about research methods. And we're going to jump around a lot here, but I want to talk to you about this. So I'm going to post this one at the beginning of the week, and the second one I'm going to post midweek, of course, before your discussion is due. Okay? It's a beautiful day today, so get out and enjoy it. And if you have any questions, as usual, let me know via message on Schoology, or you can stop me in the halls, or you can email me, but I would like to keep it all on Schoology. Have a great day, all.